Yes, welcome in. Badgers are back from their bye this week. They're going to take on USC coming up on Saturday. We'll get into that game probably more so on Thursday, Jesse. But you looking forward to your trip to LA?
Sure. I mean, it's probably not the most scintillating, exciting trip like you might see in the movies. It's one of those Friday to Sundays, but I've never been to the Coliseum, and it's a big game for the Badgers. USC still 13th in the country and a very good team, so another one of those measuring stick opportunities.
It definitely is going to be that. We're going to get into a lot of what we heard from the coaches on Monday. Luke Fickell spoke, and then Mike Tressel spoke. So we'll get into that. I know you wrote an article on that, Jesse, and we'll dive into where Wisconsin's defense is. Before we do that, obviously, as always, Home Field Apparel is the official sponsor of the camp. They have the best vintage gear you could possibly find. They have so much new Wisconsin stuff, including these new heavyweight tees that they just released. So go up to homefieldapparel.com, check it out, use the code Bucky24 for 15% off your first purchase. A little bit of a show. I guess it's a show announcement. It's kind of, it is. For a number of reasons, personal reasons, I'm not going to be traveling this year. So obviously Jesse will be out in LA, but I will not be. However, that allows me to do a post-game show, which we're going to start for away games this year coming up on Saturday after the game. The game is at 2:30. So probably, right around 5:45 or 6, going to be going live up on the camp's YouTube page. So if you're not subscribed, make sure to do that. I will likely be joined by somebody else that kind of covers the team, but certainly has opinions on the Badgers. So make sure to check that out, and looking forward to doing that for all the away games this year. All right, Jesse, let's dive into what Mike Tressel had to say. We'll go Mike Tressel first, and then we'll get into Luke Fickell, because I know Tressel is what you wrote about for today. He has a defense that probably has gone a little bit maybe under the radar in terms of its role in what Wisconsin has done this year. So much focus on the offense for deserving reasons, but he oversees a defense that at times has been good, at times has given up too many explosive plays. When you look at what the defense has done so far this year, what has stood out to you, and what did Mike Tressel have to say about it on Monday?
Well, a few different things. We know that the standard here over the past decade has been extraordinarily high, and they are nowhere near that standard. I think it's gotten maybe lost in the shuffle to some degree because of how much time we've spent talking about the offense. If you had to say between the two sides, which one is closer to the high end, and this isn't saying very much, I suppose, but you would put the defense closer or higher than where the offense is. On the other hand, that means they still have a long way to go from where they were before. So I'll start there. I think he took responsibility to some degree for what has happened, because he flat out acknowledged, basically, we haven't come anywhere close to meeting the expectations that we have. And the way that I frame the story is, and I know you remember this, the first time we talked to Mike after he was hired, the same day we got to talk to Phil Longo for the first time, it was January 2023. And the phrase that I keep coming back to is what he said: we need to figure out a way to mesh the elite, as he called it, which made sense, because Jim Leonhard, for 6 years as the defensive coordinator, had one of the best defenses in the country pretty consistently. And Mike Tressel had success at Cincinnati. That 2021 season was kind of the best of both worlds, and what a perfect world would look like, where Wisconsin's run defense was extraordinary. It broke a 70-year-old program record, gave up fewer than 65 yards a game. And Cincinnati's pass defense was second in the country. So Mike didn't want to lose what they did under Jim. He wanted to bring his own style. And 16 games in, they are nowhere near whatever that meshing of the elite looks like, for a variety of reasons, which we can get into.
Let's do it. There are a number of, you talk about meshing the elite, that means going away from a lot of the stuff that they did at Cincinnati. They've tried to incorporate a little bit of it, but we've seen a lot more of what we saw under Jim Leonhard and under Justin Wilcox and under Dave Aranda, for that matter. The nickel defense, everyone wants to talk about the base 3-4, and I get it. Oh, that's not what they run anymore, or that's what they need to put on the field. The nickel defense is their base defense. It's been their base defense for 10 plus years. That's just the way. That's the base defense for every college football team, because you always have 5 DBs on the field. But I shouldn't say every college football team. At Cincinnati, they were not they had 5 DBs, but it was a 3-3-5, and we have not seen much of that at all at Wisconsin. And we've seen at times some 3-4 this year, but they are not running what they ran at Cincinnati. And for me, they don't have the personnel. Obviously, that is probably the reason why they haven't, but we haven't seen the meshing because they haven't really thrown a ton of the stuff that they did at Cincinnati into this group. And maybe it's because they don't have the personnel to do it, but who's to blame for not having the personnel to do it?
Right.
You have the transfer portal, you obviously have the ability to recruit. So the reason they aren't able to do some of the stuff that they wanted to do at Cincinnati, or maybe they don't think it could work here. I don't necessarily buy that, but they don't have that talent that they want to run that stuff. And the only people that you can really blame for that is themselves.
Yeah, this is part of the dichotomy here that's so fascinating. And again, there are a number of other reasons. Talent matters, playmakers matter, but from a scheme standpoint, it is really interesting. I have this in my story that published on Tuesday, and so pardon me if I miss it by a snap or two, but I think from what I remember at Cincinnati in 2022, Tressel's last season there, they ran the 3-3-5 was their primary defensive package, like 627 snaps, something like that. And according to the numbers that we have, they ran that for 11 plays last year, and they've not done so this year. And Mike did talk about the fact, because I think the first question I asked was that idea of this meshing of the elite and where are you in that? He talked about the personnel that they had and the guys that Wisconsin had recruited previously. Because of who they had, he felt that it was necessary to do what they had done before. But I think part of the problem is if you have had success doing it a particular way and you come in and you feel like for whatever reason you can't do that, then you're not running the defense that it feels like you were brought in to run. And I suppose that's okay if you can continue to have success with the old way, but they're not continuing to have success. And they do a lot of the 2-4-5 stuff that's similar to what they did previously. They just haven't been as good at it. And I think a lot of this, it's a mixture. If you want to have blame that goes around, coaches get paid a lot of money to scheme things up in a way that you can have success. And yet at the same time, both these guys talked about it, but Luke Fickell specifically addressed it. He said, you can try to scheme up something, get a blitz, let's get a sack. That's not always how it works. You got to have guys that win their one-on-ones, that are aggressive, that are confident, that can make a play. And I think that's part of the issue here too. And if we're going to talk about how good Wisconsin's defense was in 2021, well, who did they have? Their top 3 playmakers are all in the NFL. Leo Chanel, Jack Sanborn, who while he wasn't drafted, obviously he's had incredible progress with the Bears, and Nick Herbig. They combined for like 49 tackles for loss, 22 sacks. So you got to have the guys too. And it just doesn't feel like up front, at least. I mean, we've talked. I think they have some pretty solid players in the secondary. I would want Hunter Wohler on my team. Ricardo Hallman has done some good things. Obviously had 7 picks last year, but up front, the playmakers just have not been as consistent. And I don't even think this is an argument. Tackett Curtis and Christian Allegro are the guys that I think have started to emerge the most. And yet they didn't open the season with those guys in starting roles, and they're still trying to figure out how to use them.
Yeah, I don't think those guys are going to end up being starters. Unless something just changes drastically. Now, again, Mike Tressel did say on Monday that Christian Allegro probably deserves to get some more reps and will, and Tackett Curtis is coming along as well. But he also made it seem, or I should say he didn't make it seem, he did say it, that he thinks that helps Jaheim Thomas and Jake Chaney down the line. I find it so fascinating that at the beginning of last year, Mumajong Meta is down at Big Ten Media Days, and by like game 3, he's not even playing. Game 4, like he played 1 snap against Purdue, and it was like, did he do something to your dog? Did he like that? Like you're just like wondering, like, what did he do to get in that doghouse? And I don't think he was in a doghouse. They just thought that the other guys better fit. But then he goes and makes an NFL team. And I'll be honest, I don't think anybody saw that coming. I know I was on this program being like surprised that he even got invited to the combine. Now his weight is down a little bit. I think he's down about 8-10 pounds than he played at Wisconsin last year. So maybe he's got some of that speed, but you look at Jake Chaney and he was down at Big Ten Media Days in July, and I think through the first 3 games has been underwhelming. And I don't. That's not fair. He has not made the plays that I think a lot of people were expecting him to make. And I know he missed the first half of the Alabama game and a large portion of the first half of or the second half against South Dakota. But 2 straight years, and now watch, he'll go find, he'll end up, going and getting a job in the NFL. The guys that they are counting on to make plays the last couple of years haven't actually done it either, right? And they went and changed up the outside linebacker room. They've gotten very little production from that group so far. The inside linebackers are probably the biggest problem, not problem, but the biggest area where some of the lack of defensive playmaking is kind of showing itself, or the inability to get off blocks from the defense and the linebackers or the defensive line and the linebackers for that matter. But it just feels like a whole host of issues there in the front 7.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. And Mike was talking about a lot of the things that he's trying to teach. And you just wonder, is it that something's missing in what's being taught? And is it just that you don't have the guys to go execute and they have the knowledge? And the more we see, the more it kind of feels that way. And just to put this in perspective, to me at least, it makes me really appreciate what we were able to witness for the last decade. It just became an assumption. Every year, Wisconsin's going to have a top 5 defense. That is really freaking hard. You've got to scheme them up, but they had every year guys who were going to the NFL. And now, right now, it just doesn't feel like they have that. But you talk about the defensive line, which we've addressed many times, even going into the season was a big question. Well, how will they hold up in the run defense? Then you lose James Thompson Jr. I think we've seen them have some issues in the run defense. And then with the pass rush is another area of concern. And Mike talked about this idea of block defeat, how that is something they talk about all the time. That's essentially the difference between being good and great. And how do you use your hands, create leverage, create length in a way that you can turn. I believe he called it a transitional pass rush. So it's not your typical, oh, it's 3rd and 12. We're going to pin our ears back and just go all out. That's not the situation that they're always going to be in. Well, how can you create something? And that seems to be one of the bigger issues here is where are those playmakers? You're talking about the outside linebackers so far, and we're only 3 games in. We haven't even started Big Ten play, but Daryl Peterson and Leon Lowry have 1 sack apiece. And John Pius, the guy that out of all the transfers, particularly defensively, stood out as much as anybody in the practices, we've very rarely heard from despite the snaps that he's gotten. So where are those big plays going to come from? And secondarily, well, if you're not getting the pressure that you need, then how can the guys in the secondary take advantage? I mean, if the quarterback is not uncomfortable, that is a problem for Wisconsin's defense. And they only have forced two turnovers in 3 games. So I look at one last thing on this point. One of the measures that I used in the story is havoc rate, which is all the plays that you would think are havoc. Tackles for loss, sacks, pass breakups, interceptions, forced fumbles. And their havoc rate is terrible, especially relative to what it was before. Even this year, I think their havoc rate is in the 120s, which is just not good enough. They have not created the havoc and the plays that they need to be an effective defense.
Would you blame, again, I think maybe it all comes back to this. Would you blame that on scheme or would you blame that on talent?
Well, I think you have to say
talent.
Talent is significant. I mean,
because the scheme you talk, yeah, because you talk about the scheme and everyone's talking, that he's defending the run with 2 defensive linemen. What do you think that they did for the most part under Jim Leonhard? I mean, offensive personnel dictates some of the looks that you're going to give them. And they played a majority of the time with 2 defensive linemen under Jim Leonhard too. It's not like that. And I don't want to compare the NFL here or not, but this whole discussion about 2 defensive linemen and defending the run when you have 2 outside linebackers on the field. And it reminds me of something that Matt LaFleur said last year about the Packers, because they were getting shredded with 2 defensive linemen on the field. And someone asked a question like, how can you play a 2-4-5? And he got upset when someone called it a 2-4-5. He goes, this is a quote. That is baffling to me when people talk nickel defense and they talk about 2 down linemen, because I don't know what that means. Outside linebackers, just so you know how us in the profession view outside linebackers, when you go to nickel defense, they're defensive ends. And we have some of the bigger outside linebackers in this league. There's 4 defensive linemen on the field. So Wisconsin, like I assume Wisconsin kind of views it the same way. The biggest difference between what the Packers put out at outside linebacker and what the Badgers put out outside linebacker, talent is obviously one of those things, but size is also another thing as well. Like the Packers defensive ends or the outside linebackers are like 270, 265. That's not what Wisconsin's putting out there. But for me, it's not about the 2 down linemen or the 2 defensive linemen or whatever it is. It's because that's not different. It's just the talent in those spots is different, and it's not good enough at this point.
Yeah, I think that's where the more I watch beginning to fall, like the linebacker play in particular, because yes, they had Keanu Benton, but I mean, how many years did we say the defensive linemen that Wisconsin had were significant playmakers or dominant? Now, obviously there's part of that you can funnel things to the linebackers, but like you had the linebackers who were going out and getting you 15 tackles for a loss.
Well, I mean, think about it though. Isaiah Loudermilk still in the NFL. Matt Henningsen still in the NFL. You mentioned Keanu Benton. Like they've had some guys that ended up going and playing in the NFL and that are still in the NFL for that matter. So it's not like they haven't had any defensive line talent, but they were not asked to do things on the other side of the line of scrimmage. They were not havoc makers. And that's what this defense, we heard it from the first time they stepped on campus, back in 22 or, January 22. It was Greg Scruggs back there. Is like, what do you want your defensive line to do? We want them to create havoc. And I know Mike Tressel said the same thing, and they just haven't done it. So, but it's not as if they never had talent with that defensive line. I think maybe we may have overlooked it a little bit, but certainly comparatively to what they had an outside linebacker and inside linebacker, it doesn't stand out.
That's fair. That's a good point. I'm glad you make it. Yeah, it's not that they didn't do their job. I suppose I was thinking of, I mean, if you look at, well, who's finishing those plays? But obviously it takes defensive linemen to be able to set them up. Even the Mike Tressel's defense at Cincinnati in 2021, like obviously you can scheme things up, and part of this has to be coaching and development. That team had 6 defensive players that were selected in the next NFL draft. I mean, Wisconsin doesn't have a half dozen NFL guys right now that you think are going to go next draft. They might collectively over the next handful of years, but like talent matters, talent wins. And I feel like that's something that Luke continued to hammer on in our conversation with him on Monday, that you just have to have the guys to make those plays.
And currently they don't, or that we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it. So they'll have opportunities this week, and we'll get into it more on Thursday, but USC's offensive line struggled mightily against Michigan. Give Miller Moss time, he's probably going to pick you apart. So it could be a huge weekend, or I guess Saturday, for Wisconsin's defense to maybe turn the corner and maybe start making some of those plays. If you're going to do it, this would be the time because they're certainly going to need it against USC. And as I said, we'll get into a little bit more of that coming up on Thursday. Luke Fickell also spoke yesterday, and he spoke for 20 minutes. Was there anything that jumped out to you? Because I think when he answers questions. Sometimes he'll actually answer the question that you ask. I want to go back. This goes back to the Phil Longo comments from a couple weeks ago, where he was talking, and we spent time on this, where it was, we may do things more conservatively, we may do things slower, we may, but it's all about winning. And in the past, we used to be able to recruit guys based on stats, but winning's always what tops that. I'm here to please Coach Fickell. And that line really stood out for me, and I think it stood out for some other folks. And so I asked Luke about it yesterday, and I don't think he really answered the question. If I'm being completely honest, he never said we're on the same page. He never said any. Like, I asked if they were on the same page. He never really answered that question. What he did say is that as a defensive coach, you don't want to meddle too much. You don't want to have a huge, be overbearing in what's happening in another room. But he did say that, when he goes into that room, and I assume he's just talking about the offensive coach's room and going in there and talking to those guys, he has made the point that the plays are right there. And I think he's talking about running plays, because he said there were a couple plays against Alabama that stood out. He didn't know exactly which plays they were, but there were a couple of gains here or there that if one guy sticks on a block longer, or if one defender makes a different choice, they're huge runs. And I remember specifically one of them. Ches Malusi was through a hole, and it looked like he had a chance to break it, and a guy got his foot, or it could have been a huge run. And I think those are, like, I think what he's saying is that he wants them to continue to run the ball, because there are some big play opportunities there. But I also, him essentially just not answering the exact question. And I guess I wasn't expecting it, but I would have at least said, I would have at least expected him to say, yeah, we're on the same page in what we want to do. If that was the case, he didn't do that.
This is one of the biggest storylines as the rest of this season plays out. What will the offense look like? Is it just going to be more of what we saw through the first two games? And that may be the case, especially when you have a quarterback change at this time, when you were going to roll with Tyler Van Dyke and at least had the potential to do some more different types of things. But yeah, it's, I imagine when you're the head coach, you're so insulated, you're probably not paying attention to other people attempting to parse words or what's going on. But he could have dispelled some things at the very least by just saying, I understand where you're coming from, and we're completely on the same page. And obviously he didn't do that, but at least I think it would be encouraging that the way he put it is him going in there and saying that I see what you're trying to do. I see that they are there. We just have to execute it better. But man, I don't, and this is just made so much more difficult by having a backup quarterback in there. I just don't know how the offense puts it into a new gear where you see what Phil Longo was brought here to do.
Right. And I think that the way that they're going about offense right now was something that was come up with in the offseason, right? Because it has been a change of how they're attacking and how they're going about things. And while, Luke Fickell right now not meddling too much at the moment, I have to imagine that there was some conversation there, that you have that significant of a change in the way that you're attacking teams offensively, that there has to have been a significant change there. And it's a change away from what Phil Longo had done throughout his career. So maybe not meddling right now. And he said, as a defensive coach, we all have an idea of what we want to see, but we know we can't do it better than the offensive coaches. But it had to, and so I think that there was an offensive discussion in the offseason, and maybe he's not being in there right now and saying, you need to do this and you need to do that. He's maybe going in there and saying, what we talked about in the offseason, it seems like it's right there, for some of these big plays to happen, stick with it type of stuff.
Again, we're in a position where we're left to parse words, but that is kind of what it feels like, where whatever that discussion may have been, it was, okay, and he's talked about this to some regard, I want to lean on this offensive line. And what does that mean? I want to be physical. I want to establish some type of identity. And that means that's going to be our bread and butter without abandoning pass plays. I mean, they're still throwing the ball frequently. They're just not throwing for explosive opportunities and coming up with very many of them. And that would be okay if this was old Wisconsin and you knew the running game was going to give you 200 yards and whoever your starter was going to break a couple big ones and average 7 yards a carry. And that's not happening. So when you don't have that, and that's what you want to rely on, it just makes it so much harder.
Again, I think it's the most intriguing thing that's left on the table for this year. Bowl game and all that good stuff. Yeah. But how does Phil Longo attack this, and are they on the same page? Will they not? Are they not on the same page? I think it's still a significant question as we go through the rest of the year and into December, and what exactly everything looks like this offseason. But that said, you're right about Braden Locke, and the wrench that it kind of throws into it, because for a second straight year, Phil Longo won't have his starting quarterback for an extended period. Now, this period's a lot further extended than he didn't have Tanner Mordecai last year, and the schedule is much more difficult. So we'll see. Coaches are paid to make things work when they're not in the best situation. Like, you have to figure out a way to move the ball, even though you don't have your starting quarterback. You have to figure out a way to move the ball. When you didn't have Braylon Allen and Ches Belusi last year, you have to figure out ways to make things happen. And that's on Phil Longo to figure out, him and his staff to figure out and see if they can't put up a fight, not just this week, but throughout the rest of the year. There were some other things that Luke Fickell touched on, specifically your question about Tyler Van Dyke and whether he could potentially return for another year. I'm not going to badger you about it, but what do you think? Do you think he ends up coming back and being able to use whatever you want to call this particular year as?
Well, I will say that I feel like he gave the best possible answer that he could have given, because I fully realize that they probably haven't talked about it, because Luke said yesterday was the day that Tyler underwent the surgery, and you probably need a little distance from the injury and thinking about your future, because he went into this thinking, this is it for me. I'm going to have a good few months. I'm going to go to the NFL. Do you really want to go through this all over again? And will your ACL heal in time? So he said, we're going to approach it like we want him to be a part of this. And he also referenced James Thompson Jr., who are, not going to see this year, that if you have that opportunity, you want to take advantage of it. But yeah, that is a big question, because, well, what does that mean? If you bring him back and he is healthy, then if he was good enough to be your start of the year before, why wouldn't he be then next year? And again, this is assuming Tyler would even want to do this. Well, what does that mean for Braden Locke? Is he going to want to stick around? Landon Locke, who is obviously Braden's younger brother.
And tore his ACL.
And yes, tore his ACL. So, there's something to be said for the commitment the staff has in you. On the other hand, we don't know what the offensive staff is going to look like. So that's a long way of saying I think if he's available and they want him, that they would keep him. But that's thinking about what else would they have in the quarterback room that you think would be better at that time. And it would be hard for me to say that there's somebody there unless, and this is the very real possibility, you go to the transfer portal again. We don't know who's going to be in there. We don't know what the interest level is going to be. And we don't know how many years they're going to have remaining. I think it would, for them to go hypothetically and get someone with just 1 year left, I think is just the worst thing for the long-term health of this program. Because even if you're good, as soon as you get good, you've got to start over. And the whole idea here is building towards something in the future. So right now, I think it's the right approach to say, look, Tyler, if you want to be a part of this, we'd like to have you. But there are just so many questions hanging in the air.
If you have the ready-made team to build around, or not build around, but to complement that quarterback, it makes sense to go into the transfer portal. Like, it made sense last year for Tanner Mordecai to come in, specifically because they didn't really have anybody on the roster that could do what they needed. And it made sense this year as well, because you have so many seniors on this team that it made sense to try and, get the best quarterback you possibly could to help them along. Next year might be a little bit different. And maybe you ride with Mabry Matoyer if he's the one that is the guy, or maybe it's Tyler again. Braden Locke, this is, I think, a job interview for him these next 9 games. If it goes well, then maybe he's the guy next year. If it doesn't go well, I can't imagine him being here next year. Like, those are like his, yeah. So there's a lot at stake in that room over these 9 games, and what exactly this potentially could look like. I would have zero problem with them going to the portal next year, but at some point you have to ride with the guys that you have on your team. And if you want to be a build, be like a developmental program and do that, then you have to actually give your guys an opportunity to play. And so, with Mabry, you have to give him at least an opportunity to play, and maybe we'll see him this year. Maybe, Braden Locke struggles, or, something else happens and maybe Mabry gets thrown into the fire. If I'm being completely honest right now, Jesse, if that happens, I don't think it's going to be a good thing for Wisconsin. I don't think it's a good thing for Mabry because I don't think he's ready.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even going to say I don't think. I feel like I know this staff does not want to have to play him this year. They don't want to put him in that position. And I know I've talked about this. We've discussed it because we saw, I think, all the spring practices and the first couple weeks of fall camp. Obviously, there's a big difference between where the top two were and Mabry, and that is completely understandable. I said this on the last show. Like, there's a reason Wisconsin hasn't started a true freshman here in like 33 years. It's just not. It's just not how they want things to go here unless you've got a superstar and no one else available. But I'm with you. I'm right there with you on what these 9 games can mean for Braden Locke. If he goes in there and he plays a notch above and can move the ball and complete, 60-some% of his passes, like, I mean, that's at least enough to show why they should give him serious consideration. It's just a tough spot, I think, for the staff to be in general, too. And Lucas talked about like the importance of the quarterback room overall and how it's more important now than ever before. I mean, we see how much movement there is. These coaches want to win now. And if you put all your eggs in the basket of a young guy who's going to be in trouble for a year, that could be very consequential for the staff and what it looks like. So it's a constant balance to strike. Do we go with someone who's more proven that can help us win now, or do we try to build for the future? And the quarterback position, more than any other position, is the one that can dictate what happens to the coaching staff.
Yeah. No, whatever level of football you're talking about, whether it's high school, whether it's college, whether it's the NFL, it determines whether you're successful or not. And Wisconsin has not had good enough quarterback play in this system. And you know what? Like, Wisconsin's best teams obviously had a quarterback that was at least serviceable and usually was a good player, like a guy that was pretty darn good. You think back, go all the way back to these last 30 years. Their best teams had really good quarterbacks, but I think, or solid quarterbacks at least. But I think it's become even more important right now than it was in 1993 or 1998 or 1999. Like Mike Samuel was not a great quarterback, but he knew his role and in that era of football could get it done. When you're running what Wisconsin has right now, you can't have just a serviceable quarterback. You have to have a good to great one to have a lot of success. And
that's exactly right, because they're not going to play a game where they're going to throw the ball 11 times and run it 50 times. They're just not. As much as Luke wants to have that physical smash mouth run first, or even if it's not run first, just a mentality to run the ball. I think about Braden coming in last year. He was still throwing 30 plus times a game. That's a very difficult spot to be in, and you better be able to execute at a very high level, because in this offense, as much as you want to try to mask the deficiencies, if they are there in the passing game, you still need that guy to throw it a heck of a lot more times than you did previously.
It's funny you mentioned that you can't run it 50 times or whatever it was, or throw it 11 times. And then, Wisconsin, the team they're facing this week, saw 12 passes last week and nearly 50 runs against Michigan. Is that something that Wisconsin could mimic? I know we'll talk about it Thursday, but I don't think so. I think Michigan is. I think Michigan's better in the offensive line. I think they have a quarterback that can actually run, and they have a running. The way that those guys are running, I think they just have a more physical attack than what Wisconsin can throw at USC. But I guess we'll see.
I mean, as currently constructed, it doesn't feel that way. And maybe, I don't know, is this a feeling out process where you do the first couple of drives and see what you're able to get? Because there have been times where if Wisconsin does that, they just keep doing it. But it's so hard, even though it's natural, to keep making these comparisons to what once was, because that's just not what it is now. And they better figure out how to meld these two worlds with Phil Longo in charge. It's just hard for me to see them going out there saying, we're going to run it 50 times and throw it 11 times.
Right. I mean, I think about another team that went into Michigan and ran it 20 some odd plus straight times after throwing in it or after turning the ball over on the first play of the second half. That was a Wisconsin team. I don't think they're at that place right now, and they haven't been for a long time. But that's also because college football hasn't been there. Now, it's funny because there is a little bit of a trend here where teams are starting to run the ball more and being more successful running the ball. Just as Wisconsin finally transitioned to trying to throw the ball more, it is kind of funny that everything comes back around. But I would expect USC to throw as much as they have at the box, and we'll see if Wisconsin has an opportunity can break out of that. Was there anything that else that stood out? Talking to Mike Tressel, Xavier Lucas did not play against Alabama, or he at least didn't play when I don't think he played. I could be wrong. Am I wrong on that or no?
I don't think he did. No,
I don't think he played. He was suited up. He was questionable going into that game, but he didn't play. Mike Tressel said that he expects to have him this week, though he said there are still a few things that has to happen for that to end up being the case. But he would be a nice addition against this passing attack. Like I look at what he did in those first two games, and Tressel talked about it yesterday. His ability to play the ball when it's in the air is not. I think it's unique, but it's also natural. And if you don't have that, it's very, very difficult to learn it. You can get better at it, but to be the type of player that we've seen from him the first 2 weeks could be huge on Saturday.
it goes back to having that innate playmaking ability. I mentioned before, Wisconsin has forced 2 turnovers in 3 games. He has one of them. He's barely played. I know he played more in the second game against South Dakota and started the second half with Nizer Fork getting a little banged up. And so you just need guys who have that quality about them, and was one of those true freshmen who really popped during the preseason. And so if he's healthy, he's going to continue to get more of those opportunities.
Yeah, he needs to. I think he needs to. Could we, big picture, could we see any of the other true freshmen get some more opportunities at various positions?
Well, the 2 that keep coming up are Darian Dupree and Dylan Jones. So Darian got a bunch of opportunities late in the last game. And I mean, the more this goes along and you don't necessarily see explosive plays from your running backs, whatever the reason, I think the more chances are going to be available for some of those younger guys, because you talk about trying to develop and look toward the future. Those guys are your future right now. And I think they've done enough to warrant some snaps. Beyond that, it's tough at a lot of the other positions. I mean, Kevin Haywood certainly seems like the future at tackle, but I don't anticipate him leapfrogging the tackles they currently have. Luke has been very complimentary of Jack Nelson, Riley Mahlman. I mean, if Thomas Heiberger is healthy, but he's not, he would have been a part of it. So I don't think there are a ton of true freshmen that you're going to see because they are ready.
Yeah. We talked about this last week. Trechka Kahuna needs to be more involved. I know he's not a true freshman, but he's a redshirt freshman, and he needs to be more involved, figure out a way to get the ball in his hands. Again, whether it's if you have an issue with the route running, if you don't trust him there, get the ball in his hands behind the line of scrimmage then. Like, just get it and let him be explosive. I think could pay dividends for the offense. I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but that is something that needs to happen, at least in my opinion. We'll see if they end up doing it. Is there anything else that stood out about yesterday at all that you wanted to hit? You wanted to hit on?
I think we pretty well covered it.
All right. We'll be back on Thursday. We'll talk about USC. We'll play a little overreaction or no, and then also make our picks for week 5 already of the season. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right. There he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Can.